how did people first spread across the Americas? We often picture archaeologists, finding tools and bones.
Right.
But what if language itself, the very way people talk, holds a kind of hidden map of those ancient journeys?
That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, so today we're diving into some really interesting research that explores exactly that.
Mm.
Could the grammar, the structure of indigenous languages here, actually reflect how humans moved across these continents thousands of years ago?
We're looking at a paper called Gradient in Grammatical Structure of Indigenous Languages Reflects Pathway of Human Expansion in the Americas.
Right.
And our aim is really to pull out the most compelling bits, see how language might echo these ancient migrations, but, without getting totally lost in the jargon.
Exactly, a shortcut to the coolest insights. I'll be pointing out those moments that make you really think, wow, okay.
And I'll provide some context to sort of help us unpack what these linguistic patterns might actually tell us about how the Americas were populated.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The general picture is people arriving maybe 15,000 years ago, heading south as the big ice sheets melted.
That's the kind of standard timeline, yes. South of the ice sheets. But it's definitely not a simple story.
Right, more complicated.
Much more. When you look at ancient DNA, it reveals a lot more complexity. You see populations splitting off in North America pretty early on.
Mm-hmm.
Then there seems to have been a really rapid push south into South America, maybe even in two waves.
Okay.
And after that, it gets even messier. Multiple sort of independent migrations into different parts of South America over time.
Oh.
There's even this specific event researchers have identified around 4,200 years ago affecting the central Andes. And genetically, those people seem linked to populations way up on California's Channel Islands.
No kidding. California to the Andes. That's quite a link.
It really is. It highlights just how intricate this whole process was.
Just like slice a highway and more like a whole network of trails spreading out over millennia.
That's a good way to put it.
And the researchers here are asking if that complex history somehow left its mark on the languages themselves.
Precisely. The core idea is whether the fundamental structures, sound systems, grammar rules, might reflect those population movements.
So this isn't about finding similar words, like in traditional historical linguistics.
Exactly. That's comparative linguistics, looking for shared vocabulary to trace language families. This is different. It's looking at the deeper architecture, how sentences are built, how sounds function.
Okay, the underlying blueprint.
Right. And those similarities in structure could be inherited from a common ancestor, sure.
Makes sense.
But they could also arise from languages just being neighbors for a long time, borrowing features, or even from, universal tendencies in how human minds work with language.
Lots of possible reasons.
Definitely. But what's really exciting here is this concept of linguistics as a population science. The idea that maybe these deep structural similarities could point to connections way further back in time than just comparing words usually allows.
That's really pushing the boundaries, isn't it? Do we have a concrete example of this kind of deep structural link?
Yeah, the study brings up the Na-Dene languages in North America and the Yeniseian languages over in central Siberia.
Siberia, wow, that's a huge distance.
Thousands of miles. But linguists have noted some really striking structural similarities.
Like what?
Things like really complex verb prefixes that mark both the subject and the object, grammatical markers that change form depending on context, even using tones to distinguish meaning.
That sounds intricate and unusual.
Very unusual to find that specific combination. It suggests a possible, very ancient connection, maybe hinting at older layers of linguistic diversity in Eurasia that got mostly wiped out by later language spreads.
Okay, so the structure, the grammar can hold these incredibly old echoes. But how on earth do you separate that ancient signal from everything else that's happened since? Like languages borrowing from neighbors?
That's the million-dollar question, really, and that's where this study gets clever. Their main goal was to try and isolate that deep history signal. So they specifically tried to account for language contact neighbors influencing each other and also the known family trees, the phylogeny.
Okay, so controlling for those factors.
Exactly. And crucially, they also brought in data from paleogenomics ancient DNA studies about those general north-south movements. They used that to inform their statistical models.
Ah, so merging linguistics with ancient genetics.
Precisely. It's a much more sophisticated approach than many previous attempts.
So what did they actually do? What was the data?
They surveyed 77 different linguistic features across 102 indigenous languages from all over the Americas.
77 features? Like what?
Everything from phonology sounds to morphology, how words are built, syntax, sentence structure, even some basic vocabulary structure elements.
A huge data set.
Yeah. And then they used this statistical framework called multivariate.
Multi what now?
Multivariate. Think of it as a tool that lets them analyze lots of these features together, and it accounts for the fact that some features might be related to each other. You know, like certain word orders often go together.
Got it. Handles the complexity. And they use this to build different models.
Yes. 3 main ones to compare. Model 1 was the baseline, just language families in contact.
Okay.
Model 2 added an expansion component. Basically, it factored in the distance from the Bering Strait along those likely ancient migration paths.
Bringing in the geography.
Right. And Model 3, the most complex one, included all of Model 2 plus an error term for those distances.
What's that mean, an error term?
It's like adding some wiggle room. It acknowledges that where a language is spoken today might not be exactly where its ancestors were during the initial spread because of later movements.
Okay, that makes sense. So Model 3 is the most realistic, maybe.
That's the idea. And most of the key results they talk about come from that Model 3.
All right, the suspense is building. They run the data through these complex models. What did they find? What patterns popped out?
Well, first off, they did see a general spatial pattern to language structure. When they visualized it, you could see gradual changes, especially down the western side of the continents.
So languages near each other tend to be a bit more similar structurally.
Broadly, yes. But interestingly, they also saw some structural links between regions that are really far apart, like eastern North America and bits of Amazonia or Patagonia.
Huh, that's unexpected.
It is, and their models seem to correctly pick up on known language contact zones.
Like where languages are known to have influenced each other.
Exactly. The model's contact component highlighted places like the Pacific Northwest Coast, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Amazonia areas linguists already recognize as having lots of interaction.
So the model is correctly identifying recent-ish influences.
Seems like it. It also picked up signals from language families, strongest for the more recent families, weaker for the really old ones, which also makes sense. Languages diverge over time.
Right. And that wiggle room for location, the error term, did that show anything?
It suggested that, on the whole, the current locations aren't wildly different from where the languages might have been relative to each other way back then. At least not enough to completely erase any potential signal from the initial dispersal.
Okay, interesting. But what about the really big finding? The one linking structure to the north-south movement.
Okay, this is probably the most surprising bit. After accounting for language families in contact, they found more structural diversity in North America compared to South America.
Wait, more diversity in the north? I thought South America was considered the hotspot for linguistic diversity.
In terms of the sheer number of languages and families, yes, often. But this is about the diversity of structures found within those languages, once you control for known relationships and borrowing.
So more different types of grammar and sound systems in the north.
That's what the analysis suggests. And the researchers propose this might reflect a longer time depth in North America. More time for languages to differentiate in situ.
Wow, okay. That flips the common perception a bit.
It does, but the really crucial finding relates to those latitudinal gradients.
Meaning changes as you go north to south.
Exactly. They looked at how those 77 features changed along the likely migration paths from north to south. Many features didn't show a clear trend.
But some did.
But some definitely did. A statistically significant number showed a clear linear relationship with that prehistoric dispersal route.
And these are the potential echoes of the journey. What kinds of features showed this pattern?
It was a really interesting mix, spanning sounds and grammar.
Give me some examples.
Okay, so whether negation saying not comes before or after the verb. The order of possessor and possessed, like do you say John's house or the house of John?
Okay, yeah.
Whether nouns primarily use prefixes or suffixes for grammatical marking.
Got it. And even something phonological, like whether a language distinguishes long versus short vowels, that's quite specific. And these features showed a consistent trend from north to south.
A statistically significant gradient, yes. The likelihood of a language having one form versus the other changed predictably, along that axis.
And this is after they filtered out the effects of language families and neighbors borrowing stuff.
Precisely. The model identifies this gradient on top of those other factors, and it wasn't just those features. Related ones showed similar, if weaker, trends, things like verb prefixes, other word order patterns, even certain consonants.
Okay, that seems potentially huge.
Yeah.
But could it just be coincidence? A random fluke in the data?
They checked for that. They ran simulations with random, meaningless data through their model. The effects they saw with the random data were about 10,000 times weaker than the effects in the real language data.
10,000 times. Okay, that's not noise.
It strongly suggests it's a real pattern. They also found similar supporting scalars when looking at other linguistic databases. And interestingly, they didn't find such strong gradients like this when they looked at Eurasia.
Wow. So it seems specific to the Americas in its settlement history.
That's the implication.
What about that later migration, the one linking the Channel Islands to the Andes around 4,200 years ago? Did the model pick up a signal for that?
That's interesting. No, they didn't find a clear linguistic signal for that specific later event when they tried to model it.
Huh. Why not?
They suggest a few possibilities. Maybe their assumption about the migration direction wasn't quite right for that event, or perhaps the linguistic signal is just weaker or harder to detect with these methods compared to the much earlier, larger-scale movements.
Okay, so that remains a bit of a puzzle. But let's zoom out. What's the big takeaway from finding these subtle north-south gradients?
The main conclusion is that factoring in those ancient migration paths really does help explain the distribution of language structures we see today across the Americas.
It adds explanatory power to the models.
Significantly, they argue that known mechanisms of language contact just don't explain these continent-wide north-south patterns, and they've already accounted for language families.
And you said these kinds of north-south gradients are unusual, right? Usually things spread east-west more easily.
Generally, yes. Later language spreads and contact often follow geographical corridors that might run more east-west, or within specific regions. Finding this deep structure aligned with the initial north-south peopling is what's particularly striking.
So it really strengthens the idea that language structure can hold clues about deep population history.
It does. As methods get better at controlling for recent factors, these older signals might become clearer. And that finding of higher structural diversity in North America fits with this potentially more time for languages to diverge there.
What about places like the Pacific Northwest, with those Naranjo languages possibly linked to Siberia? How do they fit?
The model suggests Western North America, particularly the Pacific Northwest, might represent different layers of history. Those languages, including Naranjo, seem structurally distinct.
Reflecting later migrations, maybe?
Potentially. The model actually struggled to place the Naranjo languages geographically based purely on their structural type.
Which could fit with them having a somewhat different origin or history.
Exactly. It's consistent with the genetic evidence suggesting a later, secondary Siberian ancestry component in that specific region. So the overall Pan-American gradient might reflect the earliest big movements, with other patterns overlaid later.
Fascinating. Did they look at whether some types of language features are just more stable over time, and if those showed the gradient more strongly?
They did explore that. They found a slight tendency, not super strong, but noticeable for features generally considered more stable historically, like basic word order, to show somewhat stronger effects in the north-south gradient.
So limited support, but it points in the right direction for a deep time explanation.
Yes, it's consistent with that idea, though not definitive proof on its own. They contrast this with, say, founder effect arguments about phone inventories decreasing during the out-of-Africa expansion. This study is looking at specific grammatical features with a more complex model at a different timescale.
So pulling it all together, the research makes a pretty compelling case that language structure isn't just arbitrary. It can act as a kind of cultural indicator, tracing ancient human journeys.
It really bolsters that perspective, supporting the idea of deep indigenous history across the Americas reflected in their languages.
Of course, no study is perfect.
Right.
What limitations did the researchers acknowledge?
Well, they noted their language sample could be better, especially needing more languages from Eastern North America and the Eskimo Aleut family.
Right.
And having a good Paleo-Siberian language group for comparison would really help pin down those potential Naranjo and Eskimo Aleut links to Asia.
Makes sense.
Also, we just need more basic research on how these specific grammatical features actually change over long periods within American indigenous languages. That history isn't always well understood.
So more historical linguistics work needed.
Definitely. And finally, there's still that question of why they didn't see a clear signal for that later mid-Holocene Andes event. That needs more investigation.
So lots more to explore. But even with those caveats, it's pretty amazing stuff.
It really is.
This idea that subtle statistical gradients in grammar across two vast continents could echo how people first moved into them thousands and thousands of years ago.
Yeah, it's not about obvious word similarities, but these deeper, almost hidden patterns in how languages work.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What other seemingly abstract patterns, maybe in art or myths or social structures, might also hold hidden histories of human movement and connection over these huge timescales?
Absolutely. What other kinds of silent witnesses to the deep past are out there, just waiting for us to figure out how to read them?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. So you found this intriguing. We really recommend checking out the supplementary materials for the paper. It gets into the details and truly shows the power of using language as a window into the deep history of the Americas.